So today's video will be about managing or coping with ego death, or what's also referred to as the death of self. The reason why I wanted to cover this topic is because this video is being recorded during the time of COVID-19. And so during COVID-19, a lot of us on an individual level and even on a collective basis will be going through what's called an ego death. If we're not aware of what our ego is and even what an ego death is, this can be an incredibly scary and tumultuous time. But if we have awareness behind what this is, right, and we know the stages and the process of it, we have more effective coping strategies and we can really lessen the difficulty or suffering that this phase and just transition period of our life can bring. So before we even go into the ego death itself, I believe it's important to discuss what the ego itself is, all right? So the ego is a story or narrative that we have constructed in our minds around our personal identity, right? It's a story we tell about ourselves about who we actually are. Oftentimes this is related to external things such as our wealth, our status, relationships. It can even be tied to age or religion, but it's more based on external qualities rather than internal. Now, a lot of people have this notion that the ego is our enemy or it's something to defeat. That's really not necessarily true. In fact, to be in this plane of reality, we need an ego to function and survive. It's actually necessary. If you don't think you need an ego, please go outside tomorrow and say, I'm no one, I'm nobody, I'm just one with everything, and see how well you can actually function in society. All right? The ego has a good purpose. It's here, it's designed to protect us from uncertainty and pain. The only problem with that sometimes is that that can be detrimental. All right? We need uncertainty, we need the unknown, and we oftentimes need pain to bring about growth and transformation. So while the ego can protect us at points, sometimes it can be detrimental and even inhibit our own growth. The important thing that we need to do is actually to transcend the negative aspects of the ego. This is often what we just refer to in terms of overcoming uncertainty. The ego also likes to be judgmental, it likes to compare itself to one another, and it also, it also has an over-attachment to material success. The ego has a very faulty reward system. What is important is to become the observer of the ego, notice the faulty, right, or negative aspects of it, and to kind of just overcome those. So what is ego death? Ego death is the death of the perceived self. It is the death of what you thought you wore. It is a death of this constructed story or narrative around your personality and your personal identity. Oftentimes we experience an ego death when we lose the things that our ego attached itself to, all right, which is often external. So when we lose a job, when we lose a relationship, when we lose finances or our health, right, we often are losing the very thing that we have constructed our own sense of self or our self-worth around. Oftentimes, the ego needs to have some sense of stability or safety. So we need routines, we need schedule. Remember, the ego does not like the unknown. It needs the known. So during a time like COVID, when we're experiencing this time of uncertainty, right, we can just experience an ego death by proxy of that. Just being flown out of our routine, thrown out of our schedules, okay? Also, and I've experienced this as well, you can simply go through an ego death because your core belief systems have been deeply challenged, all right? It's oftentimes when really uncomfortable truths get brought to light. As we just covered in the last slide, sometimes the ego gives us faulty reward systems or faulty incentives. So what happens when you attain those rewards? Well, if I just get this promotion, I'll be happy. If I just get this relationship, I'll be okay. What happens when you attain that and that's not the case? We can often go through an ego death because our perception of what mattered to us and what would create fulfillment has been wrong. And that creates a death of self as well. What does an ego death feel like? This is important to cover so you can kind of understand or relate whether or not you're currently experiencing one. When we're going through an ego death, a lot of uncomfortable, repressed emotions will begin to arise, such as anger, fear, anxiety, grief. Why is that? These are the emotions that you've already held inside you. They're not just things coming up due to the current present time. The ego hides us from our internal pain that could go all the way back to childhood, right? So if you're carrying in a resentment, anger, or grief related back to when you were a child, but you were really successful and you've been making a lot of money, you can hide behind that ego story. I don't have to feel my internal pain because I'm doing so well in life. But when we lose that job, when we lose that story, that construct that was hiding us from this internal pain, all of a sudden, all these feelings that we've been running and hiding from will just rush forward to the surface and need to be felt. We will oftentimes feel lost and confused, unsure of who the real us is. Oftentimes when I went through my ego death, it was like I was naked. It was like I didn't know me. It was just like I was kind of in a void. It is really normal to just kind of wake up and to just not know who you are anymore. A serious effect of ego death is also sometimes you'll notice there is a decreased will to live, and suicidal ideation is also possible. This is important because the ego really truly believes that death is preferable to an uncertain future that lies ahead, okay? So it's important to know that this is just part of an ego death. It's important to become aware of these thoughts. We're gonna go over this in the next slide. But if you're going through suicidal ideations or I don't want to be here, just know this is your ego dying, and there's a fear around what's underneath because that's a little bit of the unknown. There's also going to be feelings of being ungrounded and spacey. You're going to feel a little bit disassociated. Without the egoic structure that we've relied upon for safety and security, right? It's going to feel a little bit dangerous to be in your body. So oftentimes we can find ourselves feeling floaty or airy or spacey. If you have just a couple or few of these symptoms attached to also losing a job or something that mattered to you, it's very likely that you're undergoing an ego death. So this leads us to the main point of this video. How do we cope and how do we manage with our ego death? The most important thing, become the observer and witness to your thoughts. This is really important when relating back to the decreased will to live and the suicidal ideation. Instead of identifying with the thoughts and be like, oh my God, I don't want to live anymore, just become the observer and witness to it. Recognize that, oh my God, I am having thoughts that I don't want to live anymore. I am having thoughts that there's a decreased will to be here, okay? But don't overly identify with it. Don't say, oh, this is me, I don't want to be here anymore. Just witness you're going through a transition period and these thoughts are arising, all right? And it's likely from the ego, it's likely from this narrative or story you've constructed. We have to keep in mind that this phase in our life is temporary. The ego is going to construct false stories for you. It's going to tell you this will never end. It's going to tell you that this transition, this change is really scary. For me, when I was going through my spiritual awakening, my ego was trying to tell me that I would be this really weird hippie guy who would always wear floral patterns and no one would like me if I embraced the change. And here I am in jeans and a regular white long sleeve shirt. The ego constructs false stories, and this pain and these repressed emotions that are coming up to the surface, they're just temporary. This phase of your life will move on. We also have to allow for the mourning and grief period to run its course. Remember, this construct of who you are has almost become alive in a sense. You've been putting energy into it. So it will feel like a death. It will feel like a piece of you is dying. You need to allow yourself the space to grieve. It's supposed to feel like a death. It's important to seek out support and to be vulnerable with others. You can't just keep this all into yourself. It's also important to really begin to meditate and ask questions on who the real you is beyond the status, beyond your relationships, right? Beyond that job. Who is the real you? That's actually the point of this, is to begin that exploration. The ego is what often is blocking us from our true selves. This is a time that is calling you to go inward and to access the real you. Though it may feel like the end of the world, ego death is often a gift, and it's important to keep that in mind. Also, while we're grounded, ungrounded, and feeling spacey, find activities that help you be in your body. Find activities that help you feel present. For me, that was playing with my dog. It was often going on walks in nature. For other people, it can be yoga. It can be being around family members if they're healthy, right? Find things that keep you engaged in the present moment. More so than anything else, ego death is what allows for change. It's what allows for growth. And for those of you watching during COVID-19, collectively, we are changing. Collectively, we are growing. It's scary, okay? What we're going through is difficult. But we have to keep in mind that there is a light at the end of this tunnel, okay? That we will recover and we will rebound from this. And we need to keep in mind that all of us, in some sense, are going through what we talked about just here. And if we take the steps to cope and manage with this effectively, we'll come out of this better, stronger, and with a more valuable sense of self. All right, guys, thank you for watching. Make sure to subscribe to this channel, and I look forward to you commenting below.